Are you feeling behind in a world that just keeps moving faster and faster? Tom Friedman has some reassurance and even some solutions in his new book, Thank You for Being Late, An Optimist's Guide to Thriving in the Age of Accelerations.
So my argument is that these three accelerations, and they're all intertwined, and they're not just changing the world, they're reshaping the world.
How did politics, activism, and science converge in the face of the AIDS epidemic in this country? Author and filmmaker David France finds new ways to tell the history in his book, How to Survive a Plague.
I wanted to tell the story of heroes that people do know, like Larry Kramer. Through his writing, he really launched the community into its own response to the epidemic, and I wanted to show how he did that.
Plus, we'll talk about what editors here at the Book Review are reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Tom Friedman joins us now. His newest book is called Thank You for Being Late, An Optimist's Guide to Thriving in the Age of Accelerations. Tom, thanks for being here.
Great to be with you, Pamela.
So first, I just need to ask you to explain the title.
About 3 years ago, I can't remember exactly the date, I was meeting someone for breakfast. And often people will come 10, 15, 20 minutes late and say, Tom, I'm really sorry. It was the weather, the traffic, the subway, the dog ate my homework. This person arrived, I believe it was actually Peter Corcell, who's an energy investor. And he said, Tom, I'm really sorry I was late. And I just spontaneously said to him, actually, Peter, thank you for being late. Because you were late, I've been eavesdropping on their conversation. Fascinating. I've been people watching the lobby. Fantastic. And I just connected two ideas I've been struggling with for a month. So thank you for being late. Well, people started to get into it, and they'd say, well, you're welcome. And the point was they understood that I was giving them permission and myself permission to pause. And my favorite quote from the opening of the book is from Dov Seidman, who said, when you press the pause button on a computer, it stops. But when you press the pause button on a human being, it starts. That connects with the whole theme of the book, which is in this age of acceleration when so much is being reshaped, if there's ever a time when we need to pause, rethink, and reimagine, it's really now.
You start off the book also by describing yourself as an explanatory journalist. For those who don't know the sort of various types of journalists, they just know that they hate them. Can you explain what an explanatory journalist is?
Yeah, well, everyone goes into our business panel for different reasons. Some want to be investigators, and some want to be sports and literary writers and opinion writers, whatever, science writers. I love being a translator from English to English, taking really complex subjects and breaking them down, first of all, so I can understand them, and then so others can understand them. That kind of journalism, and we do it wonderfully, I think, as a newspaper, is more necessary today than ever, because as the world gets this fast and complex, people are dizzy these days,
right,
and they need navigators, and that's what I'm trying to do.
And how did you become an explanatory journalist? Because you did start out, as a foreign correspondent.
Yeah. I'm a really infinitely curious person. There's a quote, again, from one of my teachers early in the book, and he says, in this day and age, you can't think in the box, and you shouldn't think out of the box. You need to think without a box. And that really is how I think. So if I go to Syria, for instance, as the foreign affairs columnist for the New York Times, I'm as interested in knowing what's going on in the environment as I am in the tech community, as I am in the business community, as I am in the Islamist community. I'm interested in all these things. And by the way, that matters now because you can't understand the uprising in Syria if you don't understand that there was a 4-year drought before this uprising happened, that millions of people had to leave their land, that they were then connected by cell phones. All these things are really interconnected. So I think to even be an effective explainer, you have to arbitrage these multiple disciplines.
And you're taking three very different forces that are accelerating forces in our world in this book and showing those connections. What are the forces?
So to me, I call them the market, Mother Nature, and Moore's Law. So Moore's Law, coined by Gordon Moore some 52 years ago, the co-founder of Intel, said that the speed and power of microchips will double roughly every 24 months. And amazingly, that has more or less held up. And that's really driving everything. And Andy McAfee and Eric Brynjolfsson in their book use the image of this guy who invented chess to explain an exponential. And the game, he invented the game, he gave it to the king loved it. How can I reward you, good sir? And the man said, well, actually, I just want to feed my family, your highness. So if you would just take one kernel of rice and put it on the first square of this chessboard, 2 on the next, 4 on the next, 8 on the next, 16 on the next, my family will be fine. King said, it shall be done. Not realizing when you double something 63 times, the number you get is 18 quintillion. Roughly 18 quintillion. So what Andy and Eric say, and I really like this image, is that We're now in the second half of the chessboard when the doubling starts to get incredibly powerful, and you start to see really funky things, cars that can drive themselves, machines that have all five senses. And that's where we are. So that's what Moore's law is driving. The market for me is globalization, but not your grandfather's globalization, not containers on ships. That's actually declining. It's digital globalization. It's Facebook, it's Twitter, it's Instagram, it's PayPal. All of these digital flows that are becoming the center of our lives, our commerce, our education, our media, that's exploding. And lastly, Mother Nature is both climate change, it's biodiversity loss, and it's population growth in the developing world. And all of those are also in massive acceleration. So my argument is that these three accelerations, and they're all intertwined because more Moore's law drives more globalization drives more climate. They're totally intertwined, and they're not just changing the world, they're reshaping the world.
And give us an example of some of the ways in which they connect. I mean, the one that stood out to me was the Niger, where the climate change is...
Part of the research for this trip, I did a documentary that I started in northern Senegal, and we followed migrants, climate migrants, from these villages in Senegal where there are no men now. No men between the ages of 18 and 60. There's just too many people, for one, and then the land, because of climate change, can't hold them. So they travel from Senegal and up through Niger. They are coordinated through human traffickers using WhatsApp, and then they're sent on their way for money through Libya, and they try to get into Europe. So they are a climate phenomena. They're a huge immigration phenomena. They're a technology phenomena. All three are interacting in these ways. And that's why you can't really understand what's going on if you don't arbitrage all three. I mean, President-elect Trump came into office on an anti-immigration platform, but he also has not been sympathetic to this notion of climate change. If you want to reduce immigration, you actually have to deal with the climate forces that are pushing people here, because actually more will be coming, not less.
You also address in the book how these accelerators affect the white middle classes of Minnesota, where you grew up.
Yeah. So, think of the average white working man or woman, whether just high school educated or a little beyond, and how these accelerations affect their lives. So first of all, because I am from a small suburb town / outside of Minneapolis, I've seen this in Minnesota. They go to the grocery store now and someone's speaking Spanish to them. Or there's a Somali there at the cash register. So they don't quite feel at home. Myself, I love the fact that we have this greater diversity, but I understand this was a big change for people all of a sudden. Then they go to the men's room and there's someone who looks like a woman who's a man next to them. Then they go to work. There's a robot sitting next to them who seems to be studying their job. So if you think of the two things that anchor us in the world, where we live, our community, that sense of home, and then where we work and the identity we draw from that, these three accelerations are hammering all of them. And so people feel unmoored.
You give this example of how these forces make the white middle class in Minnesota feel like they're not at home. And your column this week was called Homeless in America, how you feel not at home, but for very different reasons.
I'm with those people who embrace pluralism, who embrace diversity, both gender and ethnic diversity. And that is a big tension, that we have in the world. My book has a theme song, and I actually thought of seeing if I could buy it. And so when you open the book, it would play this song like a Hallmark card plays Happy Birthday.
Can we play this song? What's the song? The
song is by Brandi Carlile. It's called I, E-Y-E. And the main refrain is, I wrapped your love around me like a chain, but I never was afraid that it would die. You can dance in a hurricane, but only if you're standing in the eye. And I believe these accelerations are really forcing everyone now to dance in a hurricane. Donald Trump has come along and said, I will build a wall against the hurricane. I will stop those forces. What my book is really an argument is for an I. The I for me is community, the healthy community that can move with the storm, draw energy from it, but create a platform of dynamic stability within it.
That sounds so nice. And you call the book, their subtitle is An Optimist's Guide to Thriving in the Age of Accelerations. I'd love to just focus a little bit more on how you can be so optimistic, because when I hear about those accelerating changes, I feel incredibly just stressed out just hearing about them.
And I do too some days, and I feel overwhelmed. I grew up in this freaky little town outside of Minneapolis. That the short story is this: the Jews in Minneapolis in the 40s and 50s all lived in a ghetto, basically in the north side with the African American community, and the Jews were able to get out in the mid 50s, including my parents, and they all moved basically to one suburb called St. Louis Park. from the middle 50s started to the late 50s. And overnight, this suburb went from 100% Protestant Catholic Scandinavian, basically, to 20% Jewish, 80% Protestant Catholic Scandinavian. So if Finland and Israel had a baby, it would be St. Louis Park. Mm-hmm. In this incredible explosion and interaction, and there were good days and bad days that we learned to live with each other, there was an incredible release of creativity. I grew up in the same neighborhood with the Coen brothers, Al Franken, Norm Ornstein, Michael Sandel, Peggy Ornstein, Alan Wiseman. We all went to the same high school and Hebrew school, basically.
Wow.
And I tell the story of how that community got built and how we learned to live together. Then I come back 40 years later. And now my high school is 50% white, Protestant Catholics, 10% Jewish. Now it's 10% Hispanic and 30% Somali, African American. Now the inclusion challenge looks much more like the rest of America. Oh, by the way, it looks like the rest of the world. And can the same inclusive Midwest kind of ethic that worked on this sort of white Judeo-Christian population now work with this community? And the book is still out. I say I see really good signs, but I'm not ready to pronounce on this yet. But this is the challenge. And, this is America today, and this is the world today. And so everyone wants to put up walls and all of that. I mean, really good luck with that, disconnecting in a connected world.
Do you think that the way that the Trump voter, and obviously that's a huge generalizing term, envisions that concept of community differs from the Hillary Clinton, it takes a village kind of view of community?
Let's take out the extremes in both, so the far left and the far right. And let's talk about where I think America lives, between the center left and the center right. The fact is, some of these changes just happen too fast. My friend Dov Seidman said, there's no Moore's law for moral adaptation. That takes a long time, you know what I mean? And we don't just sort of grow another moral view of the world, and view of the other and the stranger, And so the question is, how do you find that balance? But I respect the fact that people feel like my job is not anchoring me anymore. My home has got a lot of strangers in it who came all at once, not one or two, you know what I mean, but all at once. I want to work with those people. I want to engage those people. How do we think about that issue? Maybe we do need to slow down, some of these things while we catch up with ourselves. But there's one underlying thing I can't fix and I worry about. So there's a congressman from Minnesota who talked about growing up in Minnesota in the 60s and 70s. He said in the 60s and 70s in Minnesota, growing up then and looking for work then, you needed a plan to fail. There was just so much wind at our back. We were such a giant industrial power. There's so many blue-collar jobs. We were just growing. You needed a plan to fail.
Right.
Today you need a plan to succeed. Bill Clinton said in the 1992 convention, if you work hard and play by the rules, you should be in the middle class. That's just not true anymore. Now you got to work harder, relearn faster, quicker, more often. And I do worry about, what it's going to mean to be human in an age when machines have all five senses.
And how do you plan for something that, again, is going to be different by the time you get there, by the time you try to execute on the plan? And
so that's why my own politics is very eclectic. I explain in the book that I'm actually to the left of Bernie Sanders on some issues. I think we should have single-payer health care. And at the same time, I'm to the right of the Wall Street Journal editorial page because I believe we should abolish all corporate taxes and replace them with a carbon tax, a tax on bullets, a tax on sugar, and a small financial transaction tax. Now, what's behind that? What's behind that is I think we need to get radically entrepreneurial over here to pay for, I think, the safety nets we're going to need over here. And I think that's going to be the challenge for liberals, to understand, we do need these safety nets, but you've got to be able to generate, the resources for people to do that. And I think that's where politics is going to go. My broad argument about politics in the book is I think all these parties are blowing up because they were really designed to deal with the questions of the Industrial Revolution, the New Deal, the early IT revolution, and civil rights, both gender rights and racial. And now the three questions you have to deal with are these three accelerations. How do you get the most out of them and cushion the worst?
It brings me to the 18 ideas that you come up with in the book for things that you think the American government should do.
Yes.
I'm assuming one of those is the single-payer health care.
Right, and the other is eliminating all corporate taxes. But I would also double or triple the earned income tax credit. So I want to reward work. I think work really anchors you in the world because there's a lot of talk now about universal basic income, just give people money. It doesn't really feel right to me on a dignity level. You know what I mean? But I want to look for ways to amplify people who are working so that's part of the safety net, so they can be in this world. I would insist, this is a fantasy, but I would make it against the law to have a BA that takes more than 3 years. So I went to graduate school at Oxford. Oxford has an undergraduate degree they managed to teach people in 3 years.
Right.
So how about giving everybody a 25% reduction in college tuition just off the top?
Mm-hmm.
You know,
have to make high school a lot better.
That's
I gotta
right.
say.
That's exactly right. That's our challenge.
Yeah.
But at the same time, if we're telling people that the new social contract is if you want to be a lifelong employee, you now have to be a lifelong learner, then I think all higher education should be tax-free.
What are some of the other 18?
On carbon tax, we have to deal with this environmental question. I would have a commission, a base closing commission for deregulation. I would look at every regulation out there. I would look again at Dodd-Frank. There's a really fine line between preventing recklessness and preventing risk-taking. And I feel sometimes we've gone over that line. Mm-hmm. So I certainly want to prevent recklessness. But we do need to unleash the entrepreneurial energy of this economy to take care of people who I think more people will be left behind. The world's just too damn fast.
All right. I want to end on a positive note. And given the fact, again, that the subtitle of the book, which again is called Thank You for Being Late, An Optimist's Guide to Thriving in the Age of Accelerations, give us something optimistic to keep in mind looking at the results of the elections this year.
Well, I can only say from having written this book, it is amazing today how many people are able to participate. And by participate, I mean that really broadly, in politics, in economics, but also in development. When I wrote The World is Flat, that was really a book about how we were enlisting the world got connected enough that we could enlist all these brains in India to come and help solve our problems. At the time it was Y2K, if you remember. Mm-hmm. What's going on today is that has now been totally distributed, and now they're taking those technologies to solve their problems, and in ways and on cost, platforms much cheaper than ours. And I think we're entering a world where so many people are going to be able to participate in making stuff, good stuff. There'll be some breakers too, and we're going to have to handle that. But I am so excited to see a world where so many people can now participate. And I think the net result of that will be very positive, as long as we find a way to anchor them in communities, because there's nothing more important than a place called home.
All right. Spreading a little bit of cheer and optimism. Tom, thank you so much.
My pleasure, Pam. Thank you for having me.
Tom Friedman's latest book is Thank You for Being Late, An Optimist's Guide to Thriving in the Age of Accelerations. For many years, and not so long ago, a diagnosis of AIDS was a death sentence. But there's more than a generation of people alive today who aren't old enough to have experienced the politics, prejudice, activism, and medical breakthroughs that helped quell the AIDS epidemic in this country. That history is the subject of a new book, How to Survive a Plague, the inside story of how citizens and science tamed AIDS. Author David France is here to talk about it. David, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So you're a filmmaker in addition to being an author and an investigative journalist, and you made a film with the same title that came out in 2012. So sort of what was the genesis of the book? Were you working on the two together, or how did this come to be?
I started on the book first and took on the film project because I had gone back for my research for the book to remind myself of those years of vast trove of videotapes. I had trouble placing the book at first. This was 2008, 2009.
With a publisher?
With a publisher.
Really?
There was a belief that the story of AIDS had been told. Randy Shilts had told it, and several powerful memoirs had told it, and plays, films.
Right.
Everybody knew that story.
They could say the same about books about Hitler and World War II.
Probably true. But they also felt that there was a kind of an exhaustion, that maybe nobody was interested. I turned instead to the video trove and attempted to make, a film from that. And How to Survive a Plague, the documentary, is mostly based on this kind of archival footage. But my argument back then with the film and the book was that the story of AIDS really hadn't been told. And I kept saying to people, if you think you know what happened then, you're in for a huge surprise. Those plays and books, the Randy Shilts book, ends in 1985. That was before the birth of AIDS activism. Larry Kramer's The Normal Heart ends even earlier. It's about the formation of the first AIDS service organization in 1982. That's the story of a virus, a mysterious virus coming in and attacking a marginalized community. But the story of the epidemic is really about what that marginalized community did in response and how that changed everything, how it changed culture, science, medicine, politics.
But it's funny because my initial reaction when seeing the book was, of course, to think of Randy Schultz and the band Played On. And I was like, well, but that book just came out. I just read it in college. And then I realized, okay, that was a while ago. 1987, that book, I think, was first published.
Yeah.
Where did he sort of end the story? And where did you decide to start yours?
Randy ended the story in the conclusion that this viral epidemic was driven by politics. In that regard, it was a very, very significant book. It helped launch the grassroots fury and activism that came in 1987, late 86, and really began to transform the epidemic. But there were also some kind of misdirections in Randy's book. Randy was a friend of mine, now, of course, dead of AIDS himself, and one of my mentors when I was young in journalism. Because he lived in San Francisco, he saw the epidemic as a San Francisco story and not a New York story. And in fact, New York was the epicenter from the first day of the epidemic through into the 90s. It was the global epicenter of the disease and the birthplace of the political movement that rose to address it. And I wanted to correct that. He was also wary of the kind of activism that was taking place in New York and not really understanding its potential, I guess, what it was attempting to do and how it was attempting to do it.
So when you were working on the film, did you, through working in that medium, did that change your approach then to the book that you would, as you had originally envisioned it?
When I started the book in earnest, which is after the film was finished, I went back to those stories that were told in the film and tried to expand on those. And I realized then the stories in the film, while powerful and essential to the understanding of the epidemic and the ultimate development of the medications in 96 that ended the plague years, that wasn't the central story. So I just kept going broader and broader until I found what I think was the kind of the core history of what happened then. And the book crosses with the film only seldomly. There are 3 or 4 scenes that overlap, but mostly I follow a narrative that predates the formation of ACT UP in 1987, follows a parallel course through those following years.
What is that central story that you wanted to tell in the book and your argument?
I wanted to tell the story of survival, what survival entailed, not just how we survived, but what it took to survive and what surviving, how that depleted us, the condition of survival. So that's a much more emotional line through that history, I think.
Is it also about aftermath? And it
certainly is the aftermath. And I think, I had 2 years or so after the film came out to continue working on the book. And I realized in those 2 years talking to people across the country and really around the world with the film that the injury of having experienced those years was profound and perhaps unique, and certainly isolated to a very small community of people who were targeted in this epidemic. And so I wanted to go and try to understand that. What does it do to someone, to a community of people, to have experienced not only mass death, but this political disenfranchisement and utter hostility that resulted in people being divided from their own families, from their communities, from their spiritual leaders, and having been kind of thrown out. And having witnessed all of that, as we all did, what does that do to somebody?
What's it like trying to tell this story to young readers, people in their teens or in their 20s who see this as a treatable disease and don't have any experience with the terror and the tragedy that was AIDS in those early years?
Those are the people that I wanted to write the book for, the people who see, gay marriage The perfect arrival and integration of, kind of American culture. And I wanted to show what was there before and how we got here. And I wanted to explain it in a way that people understood. There's a scene in the documentary where Jesse Helms stands on the Senate floor and says just, awful things about people with AIDS.
What did he say?
He said he had no compassion for people with AIDS and that he blamed them and their perversity for this disease that they brought on themselves, and he wasn't going to shed a single tear for them. Young people who watch that in the movie laugh at him. They laugh derisively at this old man saying stupid things. They don't know and couldn't have known that he was, the center of power in Washington, that he controlled the AIDS budget, that he was influential at every level of the public health response to the disease. He was not just a silly man.
Right. It's interesting, too, your book reminds us that he wasn't the only bad guy here, nor was Reagan, but that Bill Clinton also had policies that were not exactly helpful.
Nor entirely enlightened. Although he was finally, after 12 years of Reagan and Bush, he was willing to address the crisis. He spoke of it. The words were on his lips in the course of his campaign, forced there by AIDS activists in a dramatic encounter. And he made a series of promises, which then he didn't fulfill. That was true of a lot of his agenda. I know that we were all looking to him for a real radical change in the way research was being conducted, and we didn't get it.
Who are the heroes whose work and activism you wanted to highlight in the book that people might not be aware of or have forgotten?
I wanted to tell the story of heroes that people do know, like Larry Kramer, but I wanted to tell his story in what I think is the true significance of it. He was a difficult leader and often rejected by the community and the movement, but through his writing, he really launched the community into its own response to the epidemic. And I wanted to show how he did that. He did it through a very unusual brand of screed writing. He was galvanic at every turn, sometimes saying things that made little sense to people, probably even to him, certainly to me. But there was something about the cadence and emotional serration of his writing and his timing for publication that was the essential kind of driving force in the response. But I also wanted to talk about and write about other people. There's a woman that I write about in the book, Iris Long. She was kind of a retired pharmaceutical scientist. She had kind of a failed career. She was working class. She had gotten her PhD over an extended period of time. She just really didn't fit into the pharmaceutical research world that she coveted. So she was at home when AIDS struck. And she read about it in her literature, and she thought she knew something about retroviruses. She thought she knew something about the medication that was being developed in laboratories at the time for treating AIDS. So she started showing up at AIDS organizations to try to volunteer. And she didn't find a home at Gay Men's Health Crisis in New York. She didn't find a home at AMFAR, the Elizabeth Taylor research organization. When ACT UP formed in 1987, she was at the second meeting. A very unusual figure in that world. I mean, she traveled from Queens. She's a heterosexual, married, middle-aged, unfashionable woman entering into this kind of core of young gay men who were terrified and angry in New York, many of whom had come from the worlds of fashion and theater and film and advertising and marketing. At first, they paid no attention to her. It took her a while to get some traction in ACT UP. ACT UP was a huge kind of roiling mass of people screaming, and it had very little order, and it grew rapidly to hundreds of people. And she was not a public speaker. She, in fact, privately was not a good speaker. She ultimately started the committee within ACT UP that looked at the science and developed the idea that these activists could master the science, could become citizen scientists, could engage in dialogue with, in the deepest halls of science. And she created that. She led that.
What motivated her?
I've asked her. She's a religious woman, so she had some kind of built-in or fundamental need to help.
Mm-hmm.
But she also had this degree, and she wanted to use the degree. She wanted to be useful. She wanted to be a scientist. The industry had not invited her in, and this was her way in. And she really is the most unexpected figure in this history, and she turned the history. She really created this movement that ultimately was responsible for pushing those drugs forward. Without her and without the treatment activists that she trained and empowered, that we would have seen the developments of those drugs in 95 and 96. I don't think we would have seen them rolled out as quickly as they were in 96. I think we would have had hundreds and hundreds of thousands more deaths in this country and millions more worldwide were it not for the work that she did. And I think today she still is unaware of how powerful a role that she played.
I want to go back to something you said earlier about in distinguishing Schultz's book from your take on the early opposition movement. That he said he focused on San Francisco as the epicenter, and you say that New York was the epicenter. Can you trace for us how the resistance movement began in New York?
The very first kernel of resistance came from inside a doctor's office. Mm-hmm. Dr. Joseph Sonnabend was one of the first doctors, if not the first doctor in New York, to start noticing among his patients that there was a kind of a common problem. He was, like some of these others, he was highly trained in South Africa and the United Kingdom. He'd come to this country to do research, which eluded him after a while, and he had a kind of a low practice in sexually transmitted diseases in the gay male community. But that put him on the ground to identify this problem early. He first brought it to the attention of the authorities in New York and to the New York Times. That was his work that led to that first article in the Times in July of 81. But he also sat with his patients and said, this is going to go bad, not just as a medical malady or tragedy, but as a political and economic one. Greed and animus he saw already in the early months of the epidemic. We're going to create magnify this disaster. And he said to two of his patients, nobody's covering this. Nobody's challenging these falsehoods that are being propagated. We need to create a record. And those two people were Richard Berkowitz and Michael Callan. And they began in 81 to tape record everything. Mm-hmm. And those tapes, which had never been digitized before and mostly not transcribed, were an incredible trove for understanding what was happening in those days. They identified, this was before we knew that there was a virus causing this, they identified potential or probable routes of transmission as being sexual and through blood products. And they developed the idea that it would be possible for gay men to block transmission. And they created what they called safe sex. And safe sex, I think, for many generations is a very common, understood practice in keeping people healthy. And it came as a theory from these two folks, neither of whom were trained in public health or public policy. One was a singer, the other one was a sex worker. And they wrote down their theory and published it in a pamphlet, carried the pamphlet around town. In that way, and we can see it in the numbers, they turned sexual practices around in New York and the rest of the United States.
What relevance would you say, what lessons are there in this story for people, young people, as you said, your target audience really today about, I'm assuming, resistance to some extent?
None of us really knows what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. What's been surprising, I think, to me and to many people, and especially to younger people, is the language that's being used around gay folks, around race, around transgender issues. it sounds brand new to a lot of people, and it's not. We have to remember that that's the language of the 80s, and that's the language that allowed a new disease to spread from 41 people in the first report to now 78 million people worldwide, that politics and language and ideology does that, and that has to be countered.
So sort of unfortunate answer back to those publishers who initially told you that there was no story to be told here and no possible relevance today. Clearly, that's not the case. The book, again, is How to Survive a Plague, the inside story of how citizens and science tamed AIDS by David France, reviewed this week on our cover by Andrew Sullivan. David, thank you so much again.
Thank you.
My colleagues Jen Salai and John Williams join us now to talk about what we're reading. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
All right, Jen, let's start with you. You've got 2 books in front of you there.
Yes. So a little bit ago, I had started reading A Spy Among Friends by Ben McIntyre, which is about Kim Philby and the Cambridge Five. And I got maybe about 50 pages in, and it's amazing. It's totally engrossing. The stories about Philby and what a sort of rogue charmer he was are kind of scary, but also really impressive. And then, because I had been thinking a lot about Chris Hayes's book, The Twilight of the Elites, which I had read a few years ago when it came out in 2012, I wanted to return to it, but for whatever reason, I couldn't find it. So I ended up picking up the Richard Hofstadter book, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, which seemed in some ways connected to Hayes's book, and started reading that a couple nights ago.
Had you read it before?
I had read it before, and so it's also funny when you read a book, and it's probably been at least 5 years, maybe longer, since I've read the Hofstadter, and so I see my notes in the margins, and some of them make sense to me, and some of them totally don't. But in any case, I'm at the part where he makes a distinction between intelligence and intellect, which is something I had forgotten he had written about, which I find really fascinating. And he says that intelligence is more practical-minded, and intellect is something that is all about sort of asking questions. And then he looks at how this tension between the two drives, I guess, in American culture has manifested itself, especially in the 50s, which is really the period that he's interested in.
I have such a memory of reading my first Richard Hofstadter book, which was in high school when I was a junior. For some reason, I wanted to find what I thought was like a very serious, authoritative book on American politics. And so in the school library, they had an extremely boring looking, very staid-covered The American Political Tradition by Richard Hofstadter, which I then read, being really intellectually unprepared to do so.
I was going to say a junior in high school. That's pretty...
no, I was really overly ambitious
Yeah.
at the time. I'm sure I understood about 13% of it.
That's a good 13%, though.
Yeah.
So are you
book.
going back to the Ben McIntyre now? Are you flipping back between the two? Or
I mean, I guess because this is the start of the holiday, I'm not exactly sure. I'll probably bring both with me and then see how I feel.
Well, here's my Ben McIntyre story, which is I finished reading that and I went to visit my in-laws in L.A. and I was telling them about it because they're huge Ben McIntyre fans and they'd read Operation Mincemeat and other of his books. And I said, well, there's this really curious thing in the book, which is that when Kim Philby was in Beirut, I don't know if you're up to that point yet.
No.
He was with 2 other families, Nicholas Elliott and his family. Nicholas Elliott is another huge figure in the book, and Miles Copeland, who was an American spy. It said in an aside, Miles Copeland is the father of Stuart Copeland, former drummer from the Police. So I mentioned this at dinner, and then sort of for the benefit of the entire table, some of whom include people of our generation who might have memories of the Police. This Stuart Copeland connection, I said to my father-in-law, well, you're not going to know who that is. And he said, of course I know who that is. He lives around the corner. So I couldn't resist. And I went over to Stuart Copeland's house. And I said, I just wanted to talk about his years knowing Kim Philby and Kim Philby's kids, because apparently when they were in Beirut, Stuart Copeland and played with Kim Philby's kids, and they were all friends, and wanted to see if he had any memories. And in fact, he did, and he was very excited to share. And he brought up all these old pictures of where they lived in Beirut, and all his memories. And his father had written a number of books, one of which was blurbed by Kim Philby after he was in exile in the Soviet Union.
Wow.
That's not the request Stuart Copeland gets every day. Do you want to talk about the work of Ben
I
McIntyre
know.
and
When I
Spycraft?
rang the doorbell, they're like, man, she's the exact age. She's a total 80s groupie.
She wants Sting's phone number.
That's right. All right, John, what are you reading?
I have put aside for the moment Swing Time by Zadie Smith, which I'm enjoying, but which is a big book, and I wanted something a little smaller to get through. So I picked up Elizabeth Hardwick's Sleepless Nights, which is from the late 1970s. She of course was a critic and an essayist who was married to Robert Lowell, the poet. And this is a short, very elliptical book that kind of shuttles back and forth between her childhood in Kentucky and her life in New York City. And there's really no through line to it at all. It's very fragmented. It reminds me a lot of things like Renata Adler's Speedboat and Jenny Offel's Department of Speculation from a couple of years ago. It's full of great writing about a lot of different subjects. There's great stuff about city living. There's great stuff about horse racing of all subjects, which is something I'm interested in because of her childhood in Kentucky. There's a great sort of one-page passage where she talks about a young girl in her hometown who became a prostitute, and it's just this incredible condensed character study. But I'm just going to read something about a church that she went to when she was growing up. The Presbyterian Church was agreeable in winter, with its damp cloakrooms and its snowy-haired superintendents, its subdued hymnal and discreet baptism. More memorable and disturbing were surreptitious visits to itinerant evangelical tent meetings. There it was possible to be saved more than once, saved again and again. Yes, I accept Jesus Christ as my personal Savior on the west side of town in June, accept Christ once more in the scorched field in the North End in July, and then again on the campgrounds to the south in August. Lots of the saved ones, weaving up to the front, gathered under the rhythmical arms and gold cufflinks of the preacher, have just come out of the penitentiary. Under the string of light bulbs in the humid tents, the desperate and unsteady human wills struggle for a night against the fierce pessimism of experience and the root empiricism of every troubled loser. So there's a lot of writing like that in it, so it's great. Pamela, what do you have in front of you?
Well, listeners will be happy to know that I finished The Vegetarian, Han Kang's novel, so no lurid readings about dying dogs. And I finished Hamilton. I haven't quite been able to close the door on it, I have to admit. I started watching Hamilton's America, the PBS documentary about the making of the show last night. And one of the things that it made very clear, which was a relief to me, is that Lin-Manuel Miranda obviously took some liberties in adapting the book into a musical, but it was clear that he not only did that, but that he knew other things that were not in the book. And in that documentary, you see the huge bookshelves he has of all the other source material he used for the musical. So that was nice to know, because it bothered me while I was reading it, because I could tell there were things in the musical that I knew or felt to be true, and they were not in the book.
But does this mean you have a new reading list? Is that shelf of his in the documentary now going to be your...
Oh, gosh.
The whole Hamilton bibliography? No?
No,
Okay.
So I ended up, it was funny, I was at the Miami Book Fair this weekend, and I brought both The Vegetarian and Hamilton thinking there was no way that I was going to finish them, and then, in fact, did. So I ended up in that situation that many of us have ended up before, where I was in the airport and I needed to buy something. I was in the airport with Larissa McFarquhar, who was also coming back from the fair, and we both needed to find something to read. We'd both run out of things to read. She bought something very intelligent, and I decided that I wanted something, just something diverting.
Pacey.
I wanted something pacey, plotty. So recently I was in a conversation with some of our critics here, and Janet Maslin was talking about what a runaway hit Ruth Ware's books have been. They've been on the bestseller list. And so I was really curious to read one of her books. So I picked up a copy of In a Dark, Dark Wood, which is now in paperback, and apparently soon to be a major motion picture, which is not surprising because it really does feel of that ilk of, Gone Girl and Girl in a Train. It's an unreliable narrator. It's back and forth flashing in time.
She's British?
She's British. It's very British. Actually, the best part about it, I would say, are the Britishisms, because I love how apparently in England they've gone from calling women cows to calling them moos, as in, don't be such a moo, which I would love to adopt if it didn't make me sound like incredibly like an annoying American trying to sound British, and things like, oh, that's her idea of a jolly, which I also liked. And, of course, a hen party, which is what they call bachelorette parties. So the book is framed like, in a lot of ways, like a kind of classic Agatha Christie, everyone pent in. It feels like a game of Clue. They all go to have a hen party at a house in the dark, dark wood, as they would say in England. And it's a glass house, and, mysterious things happen. It's not as well written as Gillian Flynn, who has set such a high bar. Sometimes you really can feel the sort of mechanics, and you can feel yourself being manipulated. Like, of course she's going to flash, she's going to cut the chapter off there. And of course she's going to, have a fuzzy memory here. And so you feel manipulated as you're reading it, or at least I do. That said, I am still reading, so it definitely, keeps moving you along. And this one, I expect I will have finished by the time we get together the next time. So thanks, guys.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thank you.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. Our producer is Jocelyn Gonzalez, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.